¿Cómo se llama la directora?
Sí.
¿Cómo es el orden?
Pues sí, introduce Carlos, con el nombre y introduzco al seminario. Bueno, pues, buenos días, es un placer verlos.
Sí. La voz.
Es que no se lo oí. No se lo quito la
Sí.
Más de la versión.
O un poco más alto.
O más alto.
Sí, nada más.
Muy bien, pues ya comenzamos. Es un placer estar con ustedes. Muchas gracias por asistir. Es el primer seminario offline, ¿no? que tenemos mucho tiempo, después de 2 años. Entonces es una experiencia en sí misma. Y antes que nada quiero agradecer la posibilidad de Conferencia de Letras que nos facilitó este espacio, no es fácil conseguir un espacio, entonces pues, le agradezco mucho a la facultad este gesto de apoyo a esta iniciativa académica y por supuesto quiero dar las gracias directamente a la directora, la alcance de desarrollo de Palmot, por apoyar esta iniciativa y por estar con nosotros este día. Hay que decir también, por supuesto, que este evento en este lugar, en esta facultad, ha sido posible por la intervención del doctor Luis Gómez, que de manera muy amable nos abrió estas puertas. Y pues entonces tenemos ahora la oportunidad de tener este seminario que se llama The Rise, Decline and the Persistence of Visions in World Politics. Que va a impartir el doctor Mathias de la Universidad de Bielefeld. Pero pues únicamente es para iniciar este evento académico y doy la palabra a la doctora Mathias.
Gracias, buenos días. Hola a todas y todos. Pues es un gusto estar acá con el doctor Luis Gómez, con todos ustedes, con los asistentes. Bueno, este seminario de estudios en regiones internacionales que coordina el doctor Carlos Mathias presente. Y pues quiero darles la más cordial bienvenida a todas y todos los que están presentes y los que nos siguen, en especial al doctor Mathias Albert, welcome, de la Universidad Alemana de Bielefeld, que hoy nos expondrá una conferencia sobre las regiones mundiales. Esta conferencia, este evento será presentado por el doctor Ballesteros. Sí. Okay. La Facultad de Filosofía y Letras pues tiene honor de ser sede en esta presentación. En ella, como Facultad de Humanidades y Ciencias Sociales, tenemos la carrera de Geografía, por ejemplo, y estamos muy interesados en la geografía política y en los derroteros de la geopolítica en particular. Muchos acontecimientos, como saben, geopolíticos han marcado nuestro tiempo y lo han venido reconfigurando en la formación de los bloques y las regiones mundiales que hoy conocemos. La construcción de la Unión Europea, la caída del muro de Berlín, la disolución de la Unión Soviética, la guerra de Irak, la caída de las Torres Gemelas, la recién terminada guerra de Afganistán, el crecimiento de la importancia económica de China y su entorno, principalmente de la India. Por supuesto, el Brexit y la derrota de Trump y sus consecuencias, así como los efectos del fenómeno del cambio climático en el mundo. Pero para esto, ¿quién mejor que nuestro invitado para presentarnos el declive y la recuperación de las formaciones, de la formación de las regiones mundiales, el doctor Mathias? ¿Está usted bienvenido? Welcome. Estamos seguros que su conferencia será una gran aportación al necesario conocimiento de la configuración mundial. Buenos días, se da la palabra al doctor Carlos Ballesteros. Gracias.
Thank you, Director Francis Rodriguez. I'm going to introduce excuse me, it's impossible to speak like this. Well, so, as the famous song says, it's allowed to introduce Mathias Albert, a man with a very good taste in theory. Dr. Mathias Albert is a professor of political science in the Faculty of Sociology in the Bielefeld University. He's also a professor of the University of Aarhus. He obtains his habilitation at the Darmstadt University of Technology in 2000 with a legend in political science. He's Doctor of Philosophy. He has a PhD summa cum laude in the Johann Wolfgang University in Frankfurt. He has been Hannah Arendt Distinguished Chair at the University of Toronto. He has been a board member of the European International Studies Association. He has also been member of the Executive Committee of the International Studies Association, and he has been Dean and Vice Dean of the Faculty of Sociology. The curriculum of Mathias Albert is very impressive. It's impossible to synthesize. I only want to highlight some details of this extensive curriculum. He's author and editor of more than 20 books. He's author of more than 100 articles and book chapters. He has been the leader of several research projects, for instance, the geopolitical of polar regions, or the discursive construction of conflict and international organizations in decision-making processes. Although his main research interest is in world society theory, the theory of world politics, and the evolution of the political system of society, he has also an interesting research in youth studies, and he's an expert in polar politics. Mathias Albert has developed a close collaboration with the elite of international relations theorists as Maurice Busan, Lars Erik Sederman, or Alexander Wendt, between many others. For me, it's important to highlight the book Linking Sociology to International Relations, World Politics and Decision Theory, edited with Barry Busan and Michael Sun. This book is an ambitious project to follow. It's also very useful, the book New System Theories of World Politics, edited with Lars Sederman and Alexander Wendt. But of course, it is important to highlight the book A Theory of World Politics because it's a major piece of general theory and a fine Lumanian contribution to understand the political system of world society. The UNAM will publish very soon, I hope, the translation to Spanish of this work. In the recent years, Mathias Albert has published new interesting contributions, as for example, the book, The Politics of International Political Theory, and very recently, What in the World, Understanding Social Change, edited with Tobias Berman. So we have the opportunity to converse with a very prominent author who is going to talk in the seminar about the rise, the decline, and the persistence of regions in world politics, a subject that is crucial for the seminar on studies of international regions, but also for other disciplines that observe the contemporary world. So, Professor Dr. Albert, you have it.
Well, thank you very much, my honored hosts. Thank you very much for this warm welcome. Carlos, thank you very much for this extensive introduction. You chose it well in the first sentence because, in addition to what you mentioned, I'm also a big Rolling Stones fan. So this was quite well done. Welcome everybody, all those here, and I don't know how many are maybe watching through the video conference. I'm very, very happy and pleased to be here back at UNAM, the first time at the Faculty of Philosophy. And I had imagined this to be a little different in the following way, because about mid-October, so 6 weeks ago, I started attending conferences again, live conferences with people. They were all in Northern Europe, the Nordic countries, up until the Arctic, Svalbard, and Iceland. And Iceland was a huge conference. I mean, 1,500 people in one room. Very hard to imagine. No mask. It was very hard to fathom. But I had thought, this is now the way it will go. And of course, I had imagined that this seminar here is just one further step along this road. Unfortunately, as it turns out, it will be the last one for quite a while. As you know, in Europe, the situation, the pandemic situation is getting worse by the day, quite tremendously, and all live conferences and even smaller workshops that we have planned for the next couple of weeks have already been cancelled or switched, of course, online. So this makes me even more happy to be here and to actually see people, because I'm very much afraid that it will be the last time for some time to come again. Let's just hope that maybe in spring, after the winter ends, things begin to improve again. Now, the subject I'm going to talk about, the rise, decline, and the persistence of regions in world politics, is a very demanding, and it's almost an impossible subject to talk about. If you look at I simply do a Google search, if you look at the word region, I mean, there is barely a discipline, and I'm not talking about the usual suspects, international politics, geography, or sociology, even in the natural sciences, that does not use the concept of region in one way or the other. It's a tremendously huge concept. And at the very, very end of my talk, I will maybe air a slight suspicion just why this is so pervasive a concept. I'm trying, however, to concentrate as much as possible on regions in world politics, but as my argument will hopefully show, this cannot really be done without taking more general considerations into account. So the obvious first question to ask is, what is a region? Now, empirically, it can be many, many different things. A continent can be a region. That, however, already shows us that regions are not something that necessarily are integrated or go together. Tectonic plates very often move apart. South Asia is a region. The notion of South Asia, however, already shows us it's not something that is naturally there. We don't know where exactly the boundaries are. But of course, we know that many designations of world regions that we nowadays take for granted are very much the result of area studies. A result of area studies that became very, very prominent, particularly during the Cold War, and particularly also coming out of the US, out of strategic interest. Dividing the world into regions, giving them names, establishing area and regional studies. So these are social and political artifacts to quite a certain degree. Now, South Asia is obviously something else than Baja California. Both, however, are regions. But they are very incomparable to each other, but very few people would doubt that there are regions. Now, after the end of the Cold War, there were many, many people who said that now, after the end of the confrontation between East and West, a time would follow in world politics where world order would be characterized by a rise of regions. Famous book by Katzenstein, who actually says, well, we now live in a world of regions. And in that context, after the end of the Cold War, it was the European Union that was taken to set an example also for regional integration. Without doubt, it was a region, it is a region, but the idea of a world composed of regions was ever more strongly also attached to the idea of regional integration. We will talk a bit more about what that actually means, regional integration. And basically, the expectation was that other parts of the world would follow that example of a steadily increasing regional integration. Mercosur, for example, as an integration in South America, or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, later on the ECOWAS, so the Economic Community of West African States, the regions and regional integration initiatives all around. And it was thought that these would be the building blocks of a new world order. In a way, superseding the regional integration organizations that always had been there. The idea was these would become far more efficient than, for example, the Organization of American States or the Organization of African Unity. Because if you think back to the end of the Second World War, while we often think of the United Nations as a worldwide attempt to govern in security affairs, the entire United Nations system is shot through with regional organizations, or the economic commissions that are economic commissions for continents, or associated, sometimes with a longer history, for example, the US or the OAU. Now, today, in 2021, we can look back whether these optimistic forecasts became true. And I think we can safely say that nowadays, again, regions are, well, they are both. They are out of fashion, but in some respects, they are also very much in fashion. Now, just taking a short step back from politics, regions in many respects are in fashion, for example, in culture. Cooking, people are reasoned out, use regional ingredients and regional traditions, and not import whatever you eat from the other end of the world. They are fashionable when it comes to preserving cultural customs and heritage. However, when we look to politics or world politics, it seems that regional organizations have come under quite some stress. And the shining example of the European Union, of course, is the best case for this. The ideas of an ever closer union seem to be very much under pressure. There are internal frictions. There is, of course, a major player with the United Kingdom that has left. The lorry drivers have also left the United Kingdom in this process, which creates some issues. And there are struggles about how far the European Union can actually go in integrating things. There are basic fights about what does European law mean in relation to national to national law and national constitutions. And of course, the big fights go on, particularly between the European Union and most of its member countries nowadays, and Poland and Hungary. Nonetheless, and I will come to this point later, I would argue that it is far too early. It is far too early to basically say regional integration organizations are already of the past. Quite to the contrary, I expect them to make a comeback, but in a rather specific way. And what we also, of course, see is that some fora of regional organizations at least attempt some of the gaps that are geopolitically now left by the disengagement of the United States in many parts of the world. Of course, they are not free from the new confrontation between the US and China, but they are making an effort. And I think one of the main things we can observe nowadays is that regional organizations are very often seen as the best hope to make advances when it comes to free trade arrangements and cooperation, when obviously on a global level, cooperation is very, very much hampered by resurgent geopolitical great power conflict. Now, both in real world politics as well as in academic diagnosis, regions does seem to be going through an ongoing cycle of increasing and decreasing prominence. As I said, some projects such as the EU seem to be weakening, and others might be getting stronger in order to fill gaps in the current world order. What I would try to do here is try to take stock of the history and contemporary state of regions in world politics. But in doing so, I will also make a more theoretical argument and argue that the very image of seeing regions as being either on the rise or on the decline might be misleading. So it might actually be helpful to theoretically reflect on regions as expressions of permanently changing orders that permanently also recombine functions of politics with representations of territorial contiguity. As said, some people have said there is a new world of regions. As I have also hinted at, the world of regions is not that new. I mean, you can think of the Organization of African Unity or the Organization of American States or the Council of Europe as a forerunner, whatever you think. But this is a strong tradition of organizing world politics in a regional way that goes back at least until World War I. And it's carried through after World War II and the system of the United Nations. However, I think it's important to take also a step back from the idea that regions in world politics are always regional, things covered by regional organizations. Because with these regional organizations, we are already at the idea of regional integration, to which I will come back in a second. What do we usually mean when we talk of regions in world politics? Here already it gets complicated. Regions usually are taken to be, that's quite obvious, below a planetary scale. You could not think really of Earth as one region only in relation to other planets. So it has to be part of the planet. Interestingly, strictly speaking, one could say that the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc in the Cold War were two regions. There were two regions in a geopolitical world order, although the term is usually not applied in that context. No one would speak of the Western or the Eastern region. It's not common parlance, both in political or academic language. What is, however, the case is that regions in world politics are usually meant to be something above the nation state. You would not usually say, although I will also come back to this, you would not usually say that in world politics, Mexico is a region, or Argentina is a region, or South Africa is a region. That's not established vocabulary. The established vocabulary is that it is something either comprising the territories of at least two nation states, or something that is not completely congruent with the boundaries of nation states. But the maximum usually is on a continental scale. Maybe one could say that the Americas are an exception, but that would also stretch things quite far. Usually also people would not use the word region to refer to the Americas as a whole. But that's just the practice of use that can be observed. The second thing that can be observed is that regions, of course, can be of very, very, very different kinds. They can have a security character. If you look at security or common defense organizations, and if you think back to the early days of the East-West conflict, there were actually a lot of them. I mean, NATO arrived rather early on, but in the early days of the East-West conflict, there was actually an attempt to basically regionalize the global security order. So you had things like SEATO, where anyone remembers this, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, or the Central Treaty Organization. You had ANZUS, that still exists actually, the Australia, New Zealand, United States. And on the other hand, of course, many regions we refer to have very little to do with security and defense. Very often it's about free trade or even deeper economic cooperation or even integration. But I think it's very important to bear in mind that most regions have a functional specification. They are a region of and for something. And this also is very important to remember, because the very notion of regional integration only makes sense in relation to a function being specified. You can combine your armies, you can combine your efforts in industrial policy, you can have a free trade arrangement, but there's always a functional specification. Of course, and here again, the European Union is the most far-reaching example. This functional specification can include many functions, and integration can proceed more in one than in the other side. However, this is also because in the European Union, or in the European context, we're not at the European Union yet, this idea of integration gained most purchase. The idea that regional cooperation leads to regional integration is very much an idea that was not exclusively but mostly coined in Europe. Now, this was not so from the beginning. At the inception of the European Atomic Community, the European Community of Coal and Steel, and the European Economic Community, so the three original communities, no one had great plans for regional integration beyond the narrow purviews of these individual communities. This is only something that emerged. And in the European context, the decisive step was, of course, the moment, or the process, wasn't the moment, but the process when this was combined with the very idea of overcoming national parochialities. The narrative that was installed that this is now an integration that should serve countries involved not to fall back into the confrontation that led to a horrible war. This is a narrative that was not as clearly expressed in the beginning. It was an idea that the founders had, but it only gained purchase as a narrative, as rationale for integration over time. Now, this served as a role model, and as I mentioned already, after the end of the Cold War, the idea was such regional integration would spread. These expectations, we probably agree, were overdone, but it also needs to be reflected against a very general point. There is one very fundamental issue that one needs to consider when talking about regional integration. there is no regional integration that is only integrating. Every project, every political, economic project of regional integration always also excludes. If you have a free trade arrangement, this means that those outside of this region do not participate in this free trade arrangement. If you have, as we also see in Europe, a free movement of people in the Schengen area, even without passport controls or needs for visa, this also means it excludes those who are outside. We need to erect boundaries. So every kind of regional integration has an exclusionary effect. And there is a very, very general tension that we can see already here between any idea of a universalizing globalization and a globalization that rests on these so-called regional building blocks. Because very fundamentally, regional integration projects are never only building blocks. There are also things that exclude, and mostly exclude most parts of the rest of the world. They raise a number of fundamental issues. I was hinting at them already when it comes to legal integration. It's a big issue or a big difference whether you have a free trade agreement on the one hand, or whether you actually say, well, look, you can go to a European Court of Justice and challenge your own government. That raises very fundamental issues, namely the issue that is now also being renegotiated. What does that basically mean for a national constitution? Is European law above the law? Is it below the law? There was, of course, this moment when the idea was to have a European constitution. That would have been a step further, definitely, towards some kind of European state building. That failed. And now we have the resulting controversies and conflicts that go on constantly. This legal order is being tested, and the situation de facto, though not always officially, the situation de facto now is that we are having varying speeds of integration. Some parts integration goes back, but some member states work together closer than others. For example, with Schengen, free movement of people, or with the European Monetary Union, Euro, not comprising the entire European Union, but also when it comes to the part most lagging behind, that is defense and foreign policy. So, arguably one of the main prerogatives of the sovereign states, and here we see that cooperation is least pronounced, and all the efforts to increase that have not led very far. The institutions remain weak, and much depends on the will of individual states and politicians to work together. And this leads them to bizarre situations that you find member countries of the European Union who have pledged to work together on different sides in the same conflict. Libya was a very pronounced case. The Italian on one side, the French on the other. I think it's impossible to make predictions about individual projects. One could, of course, deeply into this. But what I would like to do here is offer some more general thoughts on the role of regions in world politics. And I would like to again start this more abstract theoretical thoughts by asking the question, what is a region? And if I abstract over all the definitions that I know, in all the disciplines that I know, it seems to me that a region is a contiguous space, so space hanging together, that is differentiated from its environment according to some specific characteristic. This is the most general definition I can think about. There's a contiguous space hanging together, differentiated from its environment according to some specific characteristic. Now, contiguous space means, and I'm remaining very basic of concepts here, it can be three-dimensional. I mean, we very often think in terms of the world political map. The second page of the atlas we usually look at, but we see the colored countries. But of course, space can be three-dimensional. It's not necessarily confined to land. It can include the sea. But the most important thing is that the space hangs together. You cannot really have a region that comprises, for example, Mexico City and Tokyo. So Mexico City and Tokyo might have some things together, might cooperate, but no one would have the idea to call this a region. It's simply one of the most fundamental prerequisites of the usage of the term that things have together. There are always boundary cases. I always think of maybe, well, I mean, Guadeloupe is part of France and is part of the European Union, but also very few people would actually say it's part of a European region. There are boundary cases, but mostly it's been hanging together. Now, but the important thing is that things hang together and share one common characteristic. And this, as I was hinting at, can be specified in very, very different ways. From outside of politics, sharing a common love of a specific type of food or cultural traditions. It can be a political program and will to unity and to cooperate. It can be economic characteristics and cooperation. The region can be underpinned by some legal arrangement. It must not be. The definition of a region according to a specific characteristic does also not mean that this characteristic would not exist anywhere else. Not necessarily. It's even possible that logically to a higher degree, this is somewhere else to a higher degree. So, I mean, maybe you would say, well, there is this specific region which loves this specific food in Mexico, and maybe you have, I don't know, besides somewhere, maybe you have a little village in northern Finland who prides itself of cooking the same dish with much more energy and much better. Yeah? But still, you would not consider that little village in northern Finland to be part of the region for which this food is special. What is essential, however, is the claim that this characteristic exists in the region to a higher degree, or at least in a different kind, than in its immediate environment. That's the important thing. This makes the characteristic and the identity of a region. Now, given this definition, there are of course endless possibilities of what a region can be. And there are also endless overlaps. And I was hinting at earlier, this is very much demonstrated by the fact that region is such a pervasive concept. I mean, even medical people, biologists, use it to describe parts of the body as regions. They can be regions, as far as I understand, regions within a cell. So it's a pervasive concept, but narrowing it down on social issues, I think what it shows us is that regions are a very, very basic feature in the ordering of society. And how is that? It is so because regions express the importance of both segmentation as a very basic principle of ordering and organizing societies, and of functional differentiation as a principle for organizing societies. And what regions basically are, they are a combination of these two. Segmentation, segments hanging together, contiguous, with some kind of functional specification. And on this very general level, and this is, I think, very important to mention this, the territorial state is very obviously a region. And it is, although mostly it's not referred to as that, it is a region. It is territorial state, defined by territorial contiguity, and segmented from other territorial states, and the functional specification is the legal construct of sovereignty. That's That's it. But it is a region in world politics among many, many others. On this general level, such an understanding of regions just tells us that they will probably always be there as long as society continues to be characterized by these forms of differentiation. However, I think also that these theoretical deliberations might actually allow us to get a glimpse on the possible roles of different kinds of regions when it comes to the future of world politics. Let's again take a step back. My thesis has been for quite a while that principles, the general principles of social differentiation characterize world politics as well. I mean, historically, in the evolution of societies or society, it's quite clear that first you had segmentation, tribes, clans, families. The second order principle that arrived was stratification, where the order of society basically was described by where you were in an hierarchical order of things, and then followed as the main characteristic of so-called modernity, functional differentiation between politics, the economy, science, education, and so on. Now, the important thing to realize is that these principles of differentiation, they never have been in a zero-sum game with each other. They coexist to various degrees and in various forms. And if you look at world politics, I think it's pretty much safe to say, for example, that stratification is steady, maybe it's even on the rise. Stratification in world politics, meaning that there's a very, very distinct political order. We had this very distinct stratified orders within empires, that was very clear, expressed as core periphery differentiation, but you always had it between the so-called great powers and the smaller powers. And that is an order that is obviously here to stay, and the resurgent rise of people seeing the world according to a conflict between great powers very much bears witness to this. Segmentation is also here to stay, and it's very much reasserting itself, particularly in the form of territorial states. And this is one, I think, of the main lessons that we have learned for the past more than 1.5 years. How powerful the nation state is, and the idea that you can have self-enclosed borders. Now, if you look at the map, if you look at the global map, without national boundaries, and simply look at infection rates of the coronavirus, you do not see national boundaries. Okay, Iceland, Australia, yes, there it's a different story, but you can have full isolation. But the spread of the virus does hardly respect national boundaries. Sometimes the relevant boundaries between high incidence and low incidence go right through the country. However, the nation state has reasserted itself because of the idea that this is something that can mainly be controlled by national measures. And this is what most states have done. This is what we witness nowadays again in Europe. I mean, the Austrians do it differently than the Germans or the Dutch. But of course, it's nonsense because it's the same thing. So, but it very much shows that this principle of segmentation is reasserting itself, but comes a bit under pressure. I would argue what comes a bit under pressure in world politics is functional differentiation. And with functional differentiation, I mean the idea that there can be global problem solving in specific areas, like some specific regimes, in relation to climate change, but also in relation to free trade, for example, where you cooperate globally. This is coming increasingly under strain, but this is, I think, exactly the point where I expect regional integration organizations to have a major impact in the foreseeable future. to compensate for some of the failures of global governance, and to compensate for many of the inabilities of cooperation under the condition of geopolitical conflict. Regions can compensate some of these weaknesses, and some regional organizations are actually trying to do this. I mean, ASEAN is very proactive. Almost every day you hear about a new initiative. Which of these initiatives will fly and be effective? We do not know. But we know that regions have staying power in various respects. Very few actually die. It's very difficult for a region to die. I mean, a regional organization sometimes, yes, like Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, but lots of them have staying power. Many free trade arrangements have staying power. Surprisingly, I remember the last time I had the pleasure to be here. This was, I think, just when Donald Trump was elected. 18? Yeah. Was it in 17? 17. Yeah. And everybody was like, oh, NAFTA. It's dead. Surprisingly, I mean, irrespective of the details, it has proved to be relatively resilient. It has continued. So regions also have their cycles themselves, how much they go through. And this is very much also a function on what role they serve, and in which spaces they can actually go into. What are the deficiencies in global governance that they can possibly compensate. So I think the question is not whether regions are here to stay as an ordering principle of world politics. The question is which regions and how. What functions do they fulfill? My personal prediction would be very little in terms of security. You see very little regional security cooperation across the globe. Very little in terms of effective trade. I have a strong suspicion that regions might become more important actually when it comes to regulating and fighting climate change. This is of course absurd because we all know that climate change is a global thing. This is absurd. But as we just witnessed in the recent summit, it's also very hard to tackle globally. And climate change seems to be a thing where very often states are more amenable to work together than just go individual routes. What happens with the pandemic in global health politics? I don't know. There right now, I hardly see any sign of this happening. However, this is a thought that I wish to conclude with. All this basic function that regions fulfill in world politics makes me doubt whether this picture of a rise and decline of regions is actually appropriate. Some regions become more important, some become less important. Some regions arise, some disappear. But in a sense, if one wanted to make a very bold transfer from the theory of evolution, one basically could say that regions almost seem something like an evolutionary universal. Like most organisms have eyes as an evolutionary universal. Regions as the combination of functional specification of a contiguous space seem to be an evolutionary universal, not only in politics but across all kinds of social and natural systems. So the real question that is worthwhile studying is not whether regions in world politics are on the rise or on the decline. I find it far more interesting to study who uses these semantics and these pictures of whether regions are rising and declining. Under which conditions do politicians and academics actually evoke that picture? And what does this tell us about the contemporary state of world politics and ideas and representations of world order? And here, this is basically my final concluding thought. Here we are, I would argue, probably at a turning point, in the sense that following the idea of a world of regions being on the rise after the end of the Cold War, with an almost unanimously shared diagnosis now that they are now on the decline, I think we are very much at a turning point where we will see increasing semantics and vocabulary that regions will be on the rise, and this will be very strongly normatively driven out of hope, but also despair that global solutions become ever harder to achieve. So in that sense, regions are here to stay, and let's see what happens in this respect. Thank you, and I'm very much looking forward.
Thank you very much, Dr. Albert. Illustrated us about many important subjects. We have the opportunity to conversate, to discuss with Mathias Albert about these topics. I think we have to develop a new reflection about regions if we follow the logic of the argument that Mathias Albert has communicated us in this conference. So, well, you have the opportunity now to ask questions or make some commentaries. Please feel free to speak.
Mathias, congratulations for your great conference. It remembers me what Bertrand Russell used to say in 1953 when he says that a pandemic situation, a global pandemic situation, or a bacteriological war will emerge a supranational government. Only a dramatic global situation will push humanity to build the idea of Woodrow Wilson after the First World War. I mean, the idea that we have to go upstairs below the national state. That's true that you said that very strong construction, a lot of effort of local and social classes to build a space with market and borders, really very strong. But mentality has not reached the necessity of what climate change is telling us, that we have to arrive to a conception of just one species into one little dot lost in the space. So I think your conference is going that way. How the national states make a social conception, a scientific urgency, a tool, a scientific tool to go convince ruling classes, local ruling classes, empire or small nations to build a supranational government. I mean, I think your conference is going that way. I don't know what you think about it.
Well, thank you very much for this question and remark. I mean, what we all see now is that quite obviously what you called Brussels' expectation that the pandemic will lead to everyone cooperating was a bit off the mark. Yeah? So, we've seen the opposite. We've seen the opposite, and even in and the interesting thing is, we'll come back to region in a second, but just want to remark on even in a region such as the European Union, with an extreme degree of cooperation in interlinguages, it did not work. Even there, I mean, not to speak of most writers. Now, what she hinted, however, is a very, very interesting general issue. I mean, the idea that global problems can only be solved globally, it's not a new idea. There's always been a tension between cosmopolitanism in this sense and particularity. And I mean, many visions of world federations or world statehood, of course, never have come true. I mean, they got some way. I mean, very few people quite simply knew that after World War II, the US House of Representatives discussed the idea of a world federation. But it didn't get very far when the Cold War started. But there's always been this tension between cosmopolitan tendencies and particularistic tendencies. And there has always also been this very specific motive that in a time of extreme and existential danger, the world will come together and unite. Think of, what can I think of right away? You know this schmaltzy but very successful movie, Independence Day. The aliens come, and of course, the Hollywood story is at the end, all countries unite, and they find this huge UFO and manage to shoot it down. Of course, Americans manage to do it as all the others cooperate and are happy, and everyone is united. This is a motive you find many, many times in literature, in movies, and I think well, I'm not valuing it now, but analytically, I think the one thing that both the pandemic as well as what we witness, what happens in terms of fighting climate change, tells us this is not the case. It simply does. I mean, I'm not sure what to conceive of. Yeah? I mean, maybe in all out nuclear war with only a few people left. I doubt it even then. But why do I mention this? There is another discussion, of course. This discussion is, well, if we cannot achieve this right away, with cooperation of everyone and the transcendence of national self-interest and boundaries, maybe regional integration is a stepping stone. So why not first achieve regional integration, and then at some point, however, we move on. And I think actually it is this basic idea that still drives some of the more ambitious regional integration projects. However, as I was mentioning earlier, every integration project also excludes to some extent. So the question is, can regional integration ever be a stepping stone towards global integration? This is an open question. I mean, if I knew the answer as to whether what would be the path to a kind of global integration in order to tackle global problems, I don't know. I'm pretty sure right now that the idea that regional integration projects serve as a stepping stone is not it. No, it's not it, quite on the contrary. Many people, of course, argue, well, you need to see, you need to have a change in perception of social systems be much more intertwined with an Earth system. This might lead to something. But then also and I know this is a very abstract remark, but these are visions of unity visions of unity that also in some way stand against this very basic diagnosis that society is socially differentiated. And differentiation also always brings about difference. And that will not disappear anytime soon. And as long as segmentation is a basic way of organizing societies, in one way or another, one could even now it's getting very speculative, but one could even go as far as to say that ultimately the path to integration would be doing away with social differentiation. But that's basically
Fragile, very fragile. Yes. During the next 10 years, the question remains the same. Will it remain? If the world doesn't come first.
Well, yes. More questions or commentaries, please? You are the experts in studies.
Mathias, I will take out my mask because it is so difficult to speak with it. Thank you very much for your conference. I am very happy to see faces, people, real people, and not cameras and pads. And I think there is another dimension of regions. You have talked about differentiation and segmentation, and obviously the specific characteristics of regions. But we can talk about too hegemony, for example, and the rise and the decline of hegemonies, colonialism, imperialism, and other processes in world politics that obviously are producing regions too. If we attend Foucault's thought about knowledge and power and the productive dimension of power and knowledge, we can think about area studies as a productive force. You have talked about area studies and the beginnings of this regionalization in world politics. And I think that we have in the First World War with Wilson and the other people in the United States with a hegemony, a rising hegemony in that moment, we have this dimension of regionalization, another regionalization of world politics, different than the 19th century, British Empire, for example. And we can see, I think that how the global capitalism is obviously specializing it in different regions. And we can see maybe the accumulation of a new division of international division of labor, for example. And all these processes of colonialism that are making or producing these regions, not only by the specificities of each region, but by the necessities of this hegemony and the global capitalism and this all intercapitalist struggles in world politics. What do you think about it? What can you say about this in your own schema, in your theoretical schema? How do you see the place, a central place, or maybe I don't know, when you talk about the rise and the decline of regions, and you have said, well, it is obviously who says it is rising or it is declining. I know it is a political and a geopolitical game, but in this moment when the U.S. hegemony, for example, is maybe declining, we are in this debate, we don't know if it is true, or maybe it is in real readjusting. I don't know, a lot of processes. But in this process of the U.S. With the U.S. in global arena, not as the principal actor as in Cold War era, what do you think about regions? Regions are changing because U.S. hegemony is declining, for example, because China is maybe taking a big step in global politics, or there are many other processes, or it has nothing to do with the decline of regions, for example. I don't know. I want to hear your opinion about it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. And let me immediately start by something which I realize probably might have become very blurred and confused in my talk. I think we need to analytically, and I realize maybe I've jumped back and forth a bit. I think we really need to distinguish two things, which are not unrelated, but they are two very different things. The one thing is the explicit designation of something as a region, which we can then integrate or which simply exists, but the designation of something as a region. That is always done with a reference to a specific space and a specific characteristic, the wine-growing region of so and so. The other thing, and that's not quite the same, I would actually say that what I've just, the former is a subset of the latter, is regional forms of ordering, the regional impact of forms and logics of ordering, what general one could say regional differentiation. In relation to some kind of, let's call it reference system for the time being. Some kind of reference system. This does not need to carry the designation of the region, not necessarily that it is used, but regional differentiation or regional specification is a possible outcome of many logics of ordering. And I think this is something one can apply across actually all kinds of social or natural systems. Now, what does this mean in relation to world politics? It means that if I look at world politics from this perspective, I do not start with looking for regions. First of all, look what is my frame of reference. Now, if my frame of reference most notably would be an imperial colonial order and history of world politics, then I would see rather specific regions that have come as a result of this, that are reproduced by this, and then you can vary very much the timescales you want to look at. You can basically start with European imperialism and colonialism. You could also look at other historical periods in parts of the world. In the German case, you can look at very much the Napoleonic Wars. Yeah, you still see the regional differentiation that came from this. You could trace how specific logics of power and ordering produce regional specificities and how these change over time. You can do the same with, I would call it the global financial and economic system, intertwined with the political system, which is, I guess, another way for capitalism as the dominant mode for organizing these systems. And you see specific outcomes in terms of regional differentiation and clustering. Now, this is, I would first of all say, this is an analytical perspective on these systems. What kind of regional differentiation do they produce? This might lead to obvious other things, regional organization and regional integration, and people actually say, hey, look, there is a region, but it's not necessarily so. Quite to the contrary, I would argue that many people who look at contemporary world politics would not see a lot of spaces as still existing regions that are the direct outcome of a form of imperial colonial ordering that still is effective. There's no doubt about this. Even without foreign empire, that is in very many parts still effective. Now, an immediate outcome, and then to the specific question about maybe the outcome of the decline in U.S. hegemony, and I would say it should also be taken a bit more nuanced, because I would very strongly wish to here also distinguish between hegemony in its political or military economic dimensions, and, for example, its cultural or technological dimensions. The picture is quite different. I think here we also see that the regional impact is quite different. Regional impact is extremely different. What we see is that the hegemonic logic of political military ordering is on the decline right now. When stage comeback, but it's on the decline. It's also the official policy, it's the self-perception of the American government, not only the past one, but also the present one. It's very interesting how little the difference there is. The difference between the Trump and Biden administration is how strongly do we cooperate with our European partners in NATO. But the rest of the world, no. And what this has actually led to is a situation where you have, let's call them regions or regional conflict systems that are increasingly unaffected by all this, and powers stepping in to, and this is very basic geopolitical reasoning, but I think it's true. Powers stepping in to fill the void. The best example is the Middle East. Out of a sudden, you have Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates sending troops, fighting a war in Yemen, and the United Arab Emirates playing an active role. On the other hand, nobody's interested in the Palestinians anymore. For a long time, the main thing. Nobody gives a time. So all of a sudden, you have a region and regional conflict system that is less and less affected. Iran becomes a major player. Interestingly, this being a region where, if you construct a huge global geopolitical rivalry between the US and China, this is not the place. And the Chinese have very little interest in stepping into a vacuum left by the United States in the Middle East. But they're wise enough not even to think about it. So I think it's very important to look at the specific regional systems and see how the change in forms and logics of power and ordering affect these. Now, just one concluding footnote on this final thought. What is, however, very persistent, and you could actually go so far to say, well, this might actually be the ultimate outcome of a still very effective, I would say, cognitive or epistemological imperialism / colonialism / US hegemony. We still discuss the world in terms that were mandated by imagining and representing the world through global European imperial expansion and US hegemony. The Middle East, we now talk about the Middle East. That is very much an invention of that period. We talk about South Asia and Southeast Asia, as it was naturally clear what is meant by this and where these boundaries are. These are very much boundaries that originated in the colonial logics and were then transformed and, in a sense, also rationalized, very much rationalized through area studies in the Cold War. So, thus coming back to something I said before, in that sense, I would actually claim that US hegemony is not on the decline in some respects, particularly when it comes to science and academia, and even in departments, university departments, even in the US or in other parts of the world, where people are very, very busy doing post-colonial studies. Very few people actively argue for abolition of area studies. say, or critically question many of the boundaries. So in that respect, I'd say the US hegemony is quite light as well in these respects.
Thank you, Mathias.
Thank you so much, Professor Albert, for your excellent presentation. You invited us to think about the importance of the regional concept. And in the main academic discussion in the 1990s, about the progress between multilateralism and regionalism, right? And the scientific of the exclusion of the territories. So, in that discussion, there are no limitations, as you said, to cooperate in the international arena because in regions or bilateral relationships, the country will have more achievements in consonance with their national interests. So, in that sense, I have two questions. First, are regions incentive or not multilateralism in world politics in the 21st century? And second one is, what did you think about maybe regional politics in terms of trade? And think about the region and the concept you talk about to us today.
Okay, the second?
The mega regional trade, mega regional trade agreements, for example, the TPP, TTIP or something like that. What did you think about that? I think maybe thinking about the concept of region that was mentioned to us today.
My feeling is, and basically both of the questions are very, very, very strongly linked. Although very often it may sound as such, and although even in what I have said, it probably very often sounds as such, ultimately, if you generalize, we may need, but this is also something where this rise and decline semantics come up, where this is possibly misleading. Regionalism, in whatever sense, trade or political, regionalism and multilateralism are not zero-sum games. They are not zero-sum games. There is no zero-sum game that says the more regional arrangements you have, the less multilateral you have. I mean, I guess it's far more complicated than this, and although I'm definitely not an expert on trade issues, I think still international or global trade is a very good example for this. What is the situation? There is the idea that global trade is, or at least was, about as multilateral as you can get. First the GATT, and then the World Trade Organization. We all know that even at the peak of the neoliberal globalization agenda in the 1990s and the 2000s, was there global free trade? Never existed. There were always provisions in the GATT that stood against this. The WTO allowed exceptions. Now, the GATT and the WTO, they function more or less well. Changes. But for example, whether the WTO functions in the last couple of years, the blockade has been because of Donald Trump, blocking electing new people to this arbitration council, and not because regional trade agreements would have become stronger. Quite to the contrary, these regional trade agreements also do not seem to have become stronger, because many attempts to have them failed or are stuck simply internally. Others kind of lurch on and refuse to die. I mean, the hopes invested in Mercosur do not seem to have realized. But then on the other hand, also those individual countries who drew the conclusion that, well, given this situation, now we need to do more bilateral treaties. This is also not a very general pattern that one can detect that is successful. And I think the best example is the Brits. The great idea it has been to leave the European Union and then conduct bilateral trade agreements with everybody. They said this is much better, but each and everybody said no, folks. We didn't ask for this. We certainly do not want to make life less easy with European Union because we do special deals with you. So, in this sense, it's well. I know this is not a very academic expression, but the situation is quite messy. The situation is quite messy because you can have less multilateralism, have less regionalism, but also less bilateral cooperation. All these things can also be increased at the same time. I mean, think about this. I mean, the initial success of the World Trade Organization happened at the same time when we had massive expansion of regional trade arrangements in Europe and elsewhere. So these things do not seem to exclude each other, and this is why I have great difficulties of actually trying to do any kind of prediction in this case. And forgive me for again being a bit abstract, but very often I think the explaining factor is not to actually play these zero-sum games between different ordering logics, multilateral, bilateral, or regional. But very often the explaining factor is actually how much specific issues in themselves are on vogue or seen as very important. And trade, for example, in my perception, I mean, this is certainly not the case when it comes to actual money, and it certainly is not the case when it comes to what politicians do, witness increasing number of sanctions and trade restrictions. But my impression very strongly is that trade, except if it's like imposing sanctions on the Chinese by the Americans, right now and for the past couple of years, is not something that you revolts with. The arguments about I mean, it's completely hard to imagine nowadays that only a few years ago, people in Europe would go on the streets to protest against this transatlantic trade and investment agreement. Completely bizarre. Nobody would get up from their chair in order to do that. It has vanished as a subject. And I think a lot is explained by how prominent the subject is. And I would assume that if and when the subject, for example, of trade becomes bigger, then we will see a resurgent interest in all these forms of organization, multilateral, bilateral, and regional. The far more interesting thing to see, and I'm coming back to a point we discussed earlier on, is what happens with the now big questions. The now big questions, I would say, are a global pandemic and a climate change. These are the now big questions. Now, 5 years ago, nobody would have said it. Would have said global terrorism. That's the now big question. Whether that leads to also this, in what form it might lead to a conjuncture of all these forms of organization going forward. I mean, we earlier discussed this also very much in zero-sum terms. We said, oh, the nation states doing it themselves. But to be honest, of course, the European Union has tried. And the question is, of course, will the lesson be learned? It takes a while, in 5, 6, 7 years. See more regionalization and cooperation in this. Also, maybe globally, multilateral cooperation. And the other question, of course, is what is the attention cycle and attention span? We do not know. In 5 years' time, we will say, well, oh, this is now endemic. It's like the influenza, you know. It's not a subject anymore. Climate change will probably persist for some time to come. It might be a completely different thing. But inequality, I mean, in global inequality is also not one of the subjects that has somehow, I wouldn't say it has disappeared, yeah, but it's really not high on the agenda anymore. And so again, to cut a long story short, I think it's very important to look at what forms of organization and cooperation are done not in terms of zero-sum game. It can all become more or less at the same time. It can go in different directions, but it can become more or less at the same time. But this is also very much, again, I think a function of how much attention things get and how much dynamism is in there. Or to put it very proverbially, if there is no energy in the subject and the theme, then nothing will happen, either multilaterally or regionally or bilaterally. Simply things stay as they are.
Questions? Okay.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy for being here, already being here. Thank you for your presentation. I was thinking about what is a region? A region as a function, a region as a distinction. A region is about shared deeply, and a region as a change, as a permanent change. But I wonder if everything changes or the region change to stay as always. I mean, is at least the last 2 centuries, the region, the change is the same, is in the same order of at least 2 centuries. I wonder if everything changes to stay the same.
It's a deeply philosophical question.
As a republic process also.
I would, on this very philosophical, apologies for traveling into the area of philosophy. But I'd say everything continues. I'd say everything continues. And in continuation, in the sense of things moving on and on and on, there's always both. Yeah, there's change all the time. Well, there's change all the time. There's things evolving. But in evolution, many things, of course, stay the same. And I guess my argument has been that on the general level of society, take society as a global expression, the very general level of society, forms of regional differentiation and regional ordering have been here for a long time and will continue to be with us because they are deeply entrenched in the way that society is differentiated. And I was making the argument even more generally, saying that quite formally this is probably true even for non-social systems. Now, below that, there is of course, and we have just been discussing this, the changing importance of how regional differentiations are more important, less important, appear or disappear in respect to specific forms and logics of order. And there is, of course, regions that become more or less important, or maybe are forgotten. You can forget the region. Quite probably you can. But in a sense, if you look, let me put it in another way. If you look at world society, or even more narrowly world politics, still quite broad, as a whole, there are regions everywhere. Myriads. I mean, according to my definition, myriads of regions. And there are regions that are the result of different forms of ordering, formed in very different historical layers. The question then is, how important are they? And for what are they important? But I think you can make the argument that they are basically everywhere. And what is changing? It's a good question. I mean, probably it's an empirical question. Which regions become more important and less important? But it's not an easy empirical question because I mean, regional differentiation, specific system of reference, can be expressed in very different things. It's historical memory. The question is, how does this historical memory then translate into specific forms of ordering? And maybe one example, looking at the country I come from. Many people who look at a map would see that it's Germany. If we are talking about the pandemic, we were arguing about this earlier on, most of the actions are national. It's national government. I would make the argument, if you look very closely, many of the differences on how to handle the pandemic, how quickly and harshly to go into a lockdown, how willing to be basically to tell people to stay at home and close down schools, very much mirrors older regional divisions. You could say roughly the most important dividing line is the line which tells you how far the Romans got 2,000 years ago. It is roughly the line that separates, it's a question of how the one has something to do with each other, which is roughly the line which separates Catholic from Protestant and the Eastern atheist part of the country. So there are regions that have emerged in systems of reference that have absolutely nothing to do, of course, with this virus. The way people, governments react to it is very clearly differentiated along those lines. Now, would we draw the conclusion from this that as a region the Roman Empire hasn't changed? Certainly would not draw the conclusion that it hasn't changed. It doesn't exist anymore. But as a regional form of ordering, it's impacting quite a lot of other social systems, which I find fascinating because this really shows you this complexity of regional differentiation, regional forms of ordering things. Please.
Thank you for sharing. I want to ask, which is the role of social movements or local organization in the configuration of regionalization?
Now, that is a very good question, but I take this to primarily refer to active region building. Not what we were just discussing, regions as a form of ordering or differentiation in specific systems, but region building. this defining something as a region. Now, if we look at the first usual suspects that we've been talking about, like the European Union or regional trade arrangements, I would say that social movements or bottom-up movements do not play a role. There has always been the European movement, even after World War I, for European unification. But this has never been a mass movement, and it's very reluctant about the social movement. Of course, trade associations, big businesses are very much lobbying for regional trade agreements. So, in a very broad sense, we call that a social movement, but it's usually not what quite the contrary, what we usually associate with the term social movement, protest movements. They are more against these things. Again, if we remember, for example, the debates about the European Constitution, people went to the streets against it, and then people actually go to the streets protesting for European integration is a far more recent and much smaller phenomenon. However, and this is a broader observation again, based again back to the observation how pervasive regions are. Defining something as a region or as regional is very often a quite powerful tool also for social movements. Because they look, we are not making a universal claim, we're taking into account regional specificities here. And I'm not talking about lobbying to declare something as the wine growing region or protect whatever kind of heritage as their own, but alluring to the specific, or referring to the specifics of a region is a quite powerful argumentative tool. If someone says, well, I mean, we can't do this, I can't do this, everybody. Well, look, no, but here, in our region, this is how it works, and this is how it needs to be done. So, in this sense, this very figure of regional specificity, of course, also probably has some kind of normative impact. It's a legitimizing device. But again, the big regional integration projects in world politics, I would say the role of transnational movements has been either very small or where it had, in fact, it was very much elite driven, never bottom up.
So we can talk about regions as contested places, no, between different forces. I mean, with social movements, regions as a power technologies, no, contention of people and you know, all these economic processes and political processes as historical productions, no. Do you think we can talk about this contested places, regions as contested places, but in different scales, no? You know, in everyday life, no, but also in world politics, no, but also in a national scale. I know. What do you think about it?
I would fully agree that regions are always contested. I mean, this might be more or less politicized. They're often less politicized, but of course, this has consequences. And I mean, it doesn't mean that everything is always contested, but very often it is. And I mean, just to name but two prominent, one is a prominent example, the other one you might not know so much about. Prominent example is the long discussions about, and these are not without consequence, whether Turkey should be a member of the European Union. Since the 1960s, not likely to happen anytime soon nowadays, but a lot of these discussions for many years, this has changed in the past couple of years, but for many years, the discussions of whether Turkey should become part of the European Union were not about whether this makes economic sense, or whether this is politically desirable. Basically, all the discussions were about, is it part of Europe? Is it part of this region, Europe? Now, of course, you can say, well, it's not an easy question to answer. This is typical side political contestation. You cannot decide this on the basis of geographic or geomorphological facts. And most discussions refer to depictions on maps. But even that, I mean, where does it start, where does it end? It's a perennial contest. Another prominent example, if you look at Russia and Russian debates about identity, political orientation, it's a perennial question of whether Russia is part of Europe or not. So it's always this contestation of what it means to say that it's a European region. And this is something you even find that in Britain. Yeah, you find that in Britain. I mean, of course, we now saw it very much in relation to the European Union, but the debate always has been one whether this island is part of Europe. This reminds me of something. Very, very good friends on an island in the Baltic, out of Germany. Then use the boat and go to Denmark, and they are separated from the mainland by about maybe a kilometer at most. There's a bridge for decades. But there the saying is always, we go to Europe. They travel 1 kilometer, they say we go to Europe. The same saying is very prominent in a different sense in the UK. They say we go to the continent. And obviously the continent is something else. And a lot of all these, not only the Brexit debates, but from the very inception of the European communities, whether Britain should be part of it or not, have been debates not about whether this makes economic sense. There has been contestations about what a region is. Now, another example, just maybe to use this year, as Carlos mentioned earlier, also developed a bit of interest in polar Arctic research. Where is the Arctic? There is a lot of contestation where this is. So some people might say, well, it's the Arctic Circle. But this includes very, very, if you look at this, go around the globe, this is very, very difficult. Then others say, well, it's the tree line, up to where trees grow. Next one say, well, it's the line of the 10-degree July isotherm. So the line where the usual average temperature in July is not more than 10 degrees. Contestations of what the Arctic is and who has a say in this. This makes a lot of difference. Who can actually claim it? There are very extensive definitions of what the Arctic is. Extensive definitions which officially that China, the People's Republic of China, to proclaim itself a couple of years ago to be a near Arctic state. Didn't go so far to say Arctic, but they said near. Near Arctic state. But it's these contestations where the region ends and how it is defined. And this is the interesting thing. Harking back to this very general understanding, it needs to be defined as a contiguous space and as a function. The contestation can, of course, pertain to any of these or to both. You can not only argue about where is the boundary of a region, you can also ask, well, what's the character, the identity of a region? Is it really defined by temperature? Or is it defined by whether trees are there? Or whatever, what is the characteristic? And these, of course, are power and knowledge games that are being played all the time.
Please.
Thank you for your outstanding conference, Dr. Ahmed. And my question is about open regionalism. And what do you think about open regionalism? Because this concept doesn't have an exclusionary effect, and there are a lot of outcomes in the regions that are examples of open regionalism. For example, Trans-Pacific Partnership, that was a economic partnership for only Pacific Rim region, but nowadays United Kingdom wants to participate in this agreement. So what do you think about open regionalism?
Open regionalism, in my understanding, is of course a programmatic figure of speech. It's open regionalism. Very important to understand this. It's regionalism. But it does not necessarily mean that it leads to regions being open. It might lead to the expansion of regions. It might lead to the expansion of regions. So if you make something that pertains to North America and to Southeast Asia, something that spans both, suddenly you have increased region, you cannot have a Trans-Pacific region. If you have something like you were referring to, you have a Pacific region, and then someone in England says, "Oh, we want to be part of the Pacific region." Then I would say this is a kind of bilateral or multilateral engagement, but it would not. I think it would stretch very understanding of region too far. I mean, it might still come under the rubric of regionalism as a political or economic project, but I would have difficulty calling it a region. And I would then also predict that no name would evolve for this. Now imagine a regional trade agreement in the Pacific region, and let's call it a Trans-Pacific Partnership, and United Kingdom becomes part of this. Would we then say this is a Pacific region only? No, probably not anymore. It's a bit different. And I mean, there is lots of anecdotal evidence or anecdotes of countries trying to do this. They want to be part of that region. But never, as far as I remember, to any serious effect, or with people taking it seriously. Now, China saying we are a near Arctic state, that's another thing. But I remember in the 90s, there was also a lot of enthusiasm for Baltic region, this region around the Baltic Sea. And then the Japanese came and says, yes, we know who we are of the Baltic region, which of course is absolute nonsense. I mean, what they basically meant is we want to cooperate with these regional cooperation agreements, which then they might have done to some degree or not. I never followed this, how much they did. But nobody, of course, ever accepted the idea that this makes Japan part of a Baltic region in any way defined. So I think that's very important. I mean, we are also that makes life not easy. We are, of course, also in a very complicated semantic field of region, regionalism, regional integration, regionality, and don't even ask me how this works and start trying to translate these terms in various other languages. Probably will get even more complicated.
Hay una pregunta en el chat de YouTube. Is it possible to say that regions changed in Western because of Trump international policies?
Again, can you repeat?
Is it possible to say that regions changed in Western because of Trump international policies?
The issue of
Donald Trump international policy.
the effect of Trumpism in social or evolution of regions.
I would tend to actually, think that Trump might have been one of the biggest boosters of regionalism, at a time when everybody said it's on its way out. At a moment when it seemed as if the European Union, other regional trade agreements were having a hard time, Trump basically saying, no, we are standing back, we are going back, gave these things a boost. I mean, one obvious example, of course, is NATO. European countries were reminded that they need to cooperate closer among themselves in a regional security organization, but also in other parts of the world. One could see that at least, I need to be careful, that at least Trumpist isolationism at least underlined a surge in attempts to seek regional solutions. I'm not saying these were successful, but the idea provided a surge to the idea, look, in a situation where global multilateralism is challenged, but also, and I don't mean this in a normative sense, but in a strictly analytical sense, where the ordering function provided by American hegemony is going away, we need to find some regional arrangement. Whether and to which this degree is led to something is a different issue. And in that case, and this again goes back to the complexity of what a region is. In that case, of course, doing things regionally has not always been rather benevolent. I mean, you could basically say that things like the war in Yemen and the engagement of states in the vicinity is, of course, an attempt to regionally organize something in a vacuum that has been left by the Americans basically retreating very quickly. So, yes, I think Trumpist policies have led to at least increasing awareness that the regional level is an important level to do things. Whether things have been done successfully on that level is a different thing.
Trumpism is ambiguous. It has an ambiguous effect. A more technical question. We are using in our projects the concept international regions. It's useful in your conception, or
given that I have used it myself, it would be a bit strange to say that it is not useful. But I have to admit that I have only used it very rarely.
yeah. It's problematic.
I think I'm a bit. What it at least invites to think more about it, because I think one simply needs to be very clear by what one means when using the term. Quite obviously, the international region is not just a region comprising many countries. My personal usage of it, and I'm not sure whether you use it the same way, is that an international region is something that retains its characteristic as a region through some kind of reference to the international, but that needs to be more than simply the fact that the space covered is more than one country. So it needs to be on the side of function as well. So international cooperation or things that are somehow generally international, it needs to be part of the characteristic of the region, function of a region, which qualifies it as an international region. You could, of course, say what an international region is a region at the very moment it spans more than one country, but that would not be very productive, I think. I think we need to think what is the specifics that makes this region a region where the international comes in on the side of function.
Power. Okay. Has been many questions. Thank you, all of you. I was hoping that Sonia Decia, Dr. Decia, would ask about the future of regions, because he's an expert in future. So, well, maybe in another occasion we can think about this complex issue. So, well, I think it has been well, it has been a very interesting session. I want to thank Mathias for his excellent presentation as usual. Well, let's hope we have some more later next year. Just to finish this seminar, I want to give the floor to Dr. Gomez to close with some comments.
Thank you. Bueno, para terminar, lo voy a hacer en español para efectos de la grabación y de la transmisión. La Facultad de Filosofía y Letras quiere expresar un profundo agradecimiento a Mathias Albert por su conferencia, por la fineza del análisis referido fundamentalmente a continuidad, especialización, diferenciación, complementariedad, territorio, y también agradecer a Carlos el habernos permitido ser sede de este importante evento, a su seminario, y agradecer la participación de todos y pues decirle sobre todo a Mathias muchas gracias.
And the good thing is things are said in a certain context. Believe it or not, I understood everyone.